Hello everyone and welcome back to Stephen King Month, the final review of Stephen King Month 3. It's been a great month, full of great movies, and we've talked about everything in this whole series. We've talked about movie adaptations of Stephen King's books and novels, and even miniseries about Stephen King's work. But what happens when Stephen King takes someone else's property and makes it their own? Well, you get Stephen King presents Kingdom Hospital.
Something to fear.
I think that you're in real danger.
Stephen King's Kingdom Hospital.
Na 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 na.
There are lots of vacancies.
Series premieres Wednesday, March 3rd on ABC.
The story goes that during the filming of the 1997 version of The Shining, Stephen King found a VHS set of Lars von Trier's The Kingdom, or Reget. Stephen was so impressed by The Kingdom that he had the executive producer of the Shining miniseries at the time, Mark Carliner, go out to Copenhagen, where The Kingdom was shooting its second season, and have a conversation with von Trier to get him to greenlight a United States adaptation of his show. Von Trier actually happened to be a huge fan of Stephen King's work, that he allowed for the adaptation to be made, with him being an executive producer on the project. One of the biggest things that Stephen King didn't really know about going into writing this adaptation was medical terminology, which is a common occurrence with writing. Whenever you're writing something, you just want to, you need to do research. But if you're not really knowledgeable on something, it's good to have a consultant, which is what happened with this production. And so with this, he reached out to Richard Dooling, a former respiratory therapist and award-winning author, as a technical consultant for the project. One of the things that is still kind of a little bit impressive about this series is that in terms of directing, there's only one director for this whole series. It's very rare because a lot of television shows have multiple directors when it comes to directing certain episodes, right? Not every episode of The Mandalorian is done by, say, Dave Filoni or Jon Favreau. But when it came to this one, Craig Baxley was the person in charge of this whole thing. In fact, Craig Baxley even stated,
I was floored that the studios signed off on that, because if it was my decision, I would say bring me 15 directors. That's the logical thing to do on a television series. And for Stephen to basically ask me to do all of it and support that decision, I embrace it. I still haven't stopped.
Another thing that's a little bit unusual about this series is its shooting schedule. Now, usually with shooting schedules, for episodic television, it's usually you shoot this first episode like this week, and then you shoot the next episode. It's a production thing. But for this one, they pretty much used certain locations to shoot multiple different scenes from multiple different episodes at a time. So, for example, in one day, in one of the behind-the-scenes featurettes that you mentioned, that in one day, one of the actors had to memorize both the lines and the emotionality of where they are as a character in relation to other characters for things that happen in the 4th, 6th, and 8th episode.
To me, that was the most challenging aspect of this, considering we were block shooting the entire piece, which means we were doing part of the 15th hour on the second week of filming. So just to follow the arcs and nuances of these characters, let alone the transitions and everything else, was a daunting task.
Like today, we're shooting something that takes place in the 11th hour.
We've had to shoot a scene from the 8th show, then the 6th show, then the 3rd show.
And last week we shot something that took place, in the 12th hour, and it's like you haven't shot the first 10. It's like, where are we? What's happened? There's so much to keep track of.
That's challenging. And because our cast is so big and there's so many stories in the show, that actors go away for weeks at a time and then come back and go, okay, now my relationship with you is...
Where am I? Oh, wait, I believe the ghost now? No. Okay, I don't believe the ghost yet, but I believe that you're real, and I've seen that, so you don't, sometimes you really have to go back and go, where are we in the story?
Kingdom Hospital then premiered on March 3rd of 2004 with average ratings. And I actually remember it like it was yesterday. My dad would ask me if I would want to watch this show. It was a Stephen King adaptation, and I was like, oh, okay, I kind of like it. I'll do it. But being a second grader at the time and being told not to tell people that I was watching a show about scary ghosts, you can kind of assume at that point that I would kind of brag that I was watching a scary thing in second grade. And from then on, no more episodes were shown to me. In fact, I never watched the full series until this past week. I watched them in 2 days. It was pretty bingeable for the most part. And, yeah. But I can also see why he didn't want me talking about the show because, my mom at the time was not a big fan of me being shown very scary stuff, especially after I was shown Nightmare on Elm Street. Was not a big fan of that. Also, I do kind of find it funny that this whole thing premiered March 3rd of 2004, and then 4 years later, my dad passed away in a hospital. Yeah, I kind of find that a little bit funny. In short summation, Kingdom Hospital is about the strange goings-on in the titled hospital. The show follows the doctors and the patients they care for as they start seeing and experiencing things that are a bit otherworldly. Things begin with the show's Stephen King stand-in named Peter Rickman, played by Jack Coleman, being injured in oddly the same fashion as Stephen King previously did years prior in his fabled car accident. And just in case you think that's a little bit of a hyperbole, listen to this in this bonus features.
We added the character of Peter Rickman, who has this terrible accident where he's hit by a van while he's jogging at the side of the road. And obviously that came from my experience. And, Mark Carliner, the producer, did a number of interviews who said, this is exactly what happened to Stephen King. And I'm thinking, oh my God, people are going to think that I believe a gigantic psychedelic anteater came out of the bushes and rescued me from the side of the road.
As the ambulances come to pick Peter up, a creature named Antibus, or Anubis, shows up to tell him that he is going to do a solid for him, but in return, he has to do a solid for Antibus. One of the things I actually kind of find a little bit impressive about this early 2000s show is the creature, Antibus. Antibus is this fully CG character, and they describe him like Gollum in the bonus features, but originally they had a practical effect for Antibus. It was going to be an animatronic puppet that someone was going to step into, as well as have a motorized function of the head, but they also found that it wasn't mimicking the movements of an anteater just correctly enough. So they basically said fuck it and used that puppet as sort of a stand-in in certain scenes where characters have to personally interact with the creature, and then put some CG overlays with it, but a majority of the time the creature itself is CG. And the CG for 2004, it's not necessarily that bad. Like, yeah, there's some CG things that happen in the show that, yeah, definitely do look really kind of bad and cheesy. Like, there's a clock that falls off the wall in one of the later episodes, and the way they film it, it's like, it's this CG clock, and you notice that it's CG. So it's not, like, the best thing ever. But in terms of the creature design, it looks mostly interesting, especially with the razor-sharp teeth that give it its more distinctive edge. When we get to the hospital, we primarily follow a few key groups. The first is the new head of neurology named Dr. Stegman, played by Bruce Davidson. He has a bit of a shady past regarding a potential malpractice suit he did at Boston General, and was transferred to Kingdom Hospital in response to that report. He reports to Dr. Jesse James, who is the head of the hospital, played by Ed Begley Jr. Dr. James also happens to be in this sort of odd secret fraternity called the Keepers of the Kingdom, which doesn't necessarily get expanded upon in this show, other than it's a fraternity. Dr. Stegman is a no-nonsense person who, over the course of the show, gets progressively more enraged and manic. Like, if you want to know how manic he really becomes, there's a part in the show where he can't find a parking spot, and he's willing to park on a helipad. You can't park on a helipad at a hospital. It's just partially illegal. And, when you have people that are being life-flighted to the hospital, that's not exactly a good place to be parking your car. But here's the funny thing that I noticed in that episode. If you look at the security footage of where he parks, you can clearly see that there are parking spots next to the helipad that are completely open for him. So that just goes to prove that he really doesn't give a shit. On the other side of this divide between science and spiritualism is Mrs. Drews. She is the resident psychic medium who comes across a ghost girl named Mary, and for the whole show is trying to help this little girl try to figure out what she is, what she's doing, and how to save the whole hospital eventually. And stuck between both of these extremes is Dr. Hook, played by Andrew McCarthy. He is just a doctor who definitely is grounded in science for the most part, like Dr. Stegman, but has a little bit of a curiosity, like with Mrs. Drews. He also has his own section of the building he stays in called Hook's Kingdom. I know, creative, right? During the show, he gets into a relationship with a doctor named Christine. So this triangle here points to the biggest theme of the show that unfortunately doesn't necessarily get expanded upon in a lot of ways, and that is the sort of science versus spirituality or otherworld isms that you might come across in Stephen King literature. It's not necessarily that much expanded because it's primarily focused on saying, okay, well, it's actually all real, and it falls into one of the biggest cliches of a lot of the paranormal stuff that Stephen King writes, and that is all the people that say that the otherworldly stuff doesn't exist is always wrong 100% of the time. There's like no leeway, there's no like questioning it. Not a lot of people really question it. Maybe except for Hook in a couple episodes, but after the initial few episodes, he kind of starts to go with it just a little bit. So there's not much pushback with it other than with Dr. Stegman telling her that she's a crazy person and having her get her hearing checked.
Find her to her bed with a slow IV drip.
Why otology? Why my ears?
Something dreadfully wrong with her hearing. Watch this. Go to your room! No layer in your own bed, Mrs. Munchausen! See, I keep doing that, and every time I turn around, she's back wandering the halls.
Now, Dr. Stegman isn't necessarily one of the only physical threats in the world. There's also an arsonist who turns up at one point, but the other sort of threats in terms of what's happening to the hospital is earthquakes. This hospital experiences weird earthquakes all the time for something that is localized in Maine. I always found that kind of weird how, even in Maine they have earthquakes. I thought it was just kind of like, West Coast type of stuff, but, I'm wrong. I don't know seismology. Give me a break. But this earthquake gets progressively worse as the series goes on, to the point where it even threatens the whole entire hospital, and a group of people has to try to figure out how to stop it from happening. But it's not just the earthquakes or Dr. Stegman that's in play in terms of how threatening these characters can be, or these things can be. There's also ghosts as well. You have Paul, who doesn't necessarily get much of a backstory other than he's a controlling, manipulative asshole who, at one point, in terms of wanting to kill Peter, one of the main characters, he enlists the help of an arsonist who tried to commit suicide in prison, and winds up in Peter's whole, section of the hospital, and he tries to light him on fire, but unfortunately he lights himself on fire like a toasty critter, and then eventually gets shot by cops. Like, that's just as much of a threat as he is. And look, you would think that he would be a little bit of a bigger threat because, he went to prison for murder, but, he doesn't have as much menace, unfortunately, and I wish he was in it just a little bit more. While the show itself tries to find some seriousness in its exploration of the supernatural in the series, part of the show's DNA is, dark humor and weird humor. One of the running jokes of the show is that Dr. Stegman's car routinely gets vandalized more and more. And there's even a ghost who doesn't have a head, who's trying to find his head because someone took it off of him in the living world, and so he's been trying to find it in the spirit one. Although, I will say that joke kind of gets old after a while and does add a little bit of, padding every once in a while. It's like, oh, look, there he is again. Will he find his head? I don't know. As part of the structure of some episodes, there are two people in the show called Krista and Abel that act like an audience commentator, where they comment on the events currently happening in the episode. And they also happen to know just a little bit more than the main characters all the time. In terms of the locations used in the show, we already know of Kingdom Hospital itself, but there is an extra dimension between life and death in the show. Some call it the Old Kingdom, and Mrs. Drews calls it the Swedenborgian space. Or Swedenborgian space, I have no idea how to pronounce it. It's kind of like the Upside Down, but for ghosts. This space acts like a doorway to other dimensions, and honestly, it's a little confusing and not necessarily the most well fleshed out idea. And I wish if it ever got a season 2, back in 2004, they probably could have explored it just a little bit more, but who knows? It'll never happen. There were some tiny things I also felt a little bit inconsistent in the show. For example, there's a narrator that starts the show off with the history of the mill and, routinely comes back in through the episode to, reintroduce us to Kingdom Hospital and ends with, I hope you enjoy your stay and all that stuff. But that narrator doesn't even come back till, episode 5, and then he doesn't even come back after that until the last 2 episodes to be like, oh, okay, well, we're almost to the end of the show, and then, Like, the final episode, he only does, like, the first part of the episode and just leaves. There's no, like, capping, like, ending for it. So the narrator in this whole thing, the usage of it is just a little inconsistent, but I can also say it's like, here's him at the start, here's him in the middle, here's him at the end. I think it's kind of fine, but it's a little bit inconsistent. There's also this whole thing with, like, dogs in the show where, dogs will have this sort of internal monologue where, they'll talk, but, like, it's rarely used, right? So they'll use it towards the beginning of the show, but it's always inconsistent of when they'll put the dog's inner monologue to. Like, it's some sort of joke that they, like, have a punctuation point in. But if you remove any of the dialogue that the dogs use in this show, it's basically, like, worthless. Like, you don't really miss anything other than some really bad jokes.
Way to go, Slick. Who's gonna feed me now?
I wouldn't actually say the show itself is horrifying. I've seen some people say that it's a horror show, but it's not really horrifying in a scary hospital sense. But rather, the show finds its scares in malpractices. Unfortunately, a lot of the horror that could be had from this piece of television isn't really until the final 2 episodes of the show, where we discuss the fire and what really happened to the ghosts of Mary and a lot of other people. The whole thing, that's where the horror is. But before we get into discussing the finale of the series, I want to turn your attention to episode 10, entitled Butterfingers. This episode as a whole is mostly a filler episode involving a former baseball player who is a disgrace to his community that ends up trying to commit suicide, but winds up in Kingdom Hospital. The episode was pretty basic for the most part, but for, like, the first half of the episode, it's just doctors just reacting to the baseball game of their local baseball team, like, for the first 15 minutes of the episode. And then the rest of it is this guy who does, commit suicide, goes to Kingdom Hospital, and finds himself trapped in the Old Kingdom. And in order to save his soul, Peter has to go into the Old Kingdom and try to get him back to his body. However, this is where we get into one of the weirder and crucial concepts of the show going forward before the finale, and that is, in this other world, you can go back in time and change things which alters the timeline of events, but oddly doesn't change the positioning of most people in the real world. So instead of failing to catch the ball at the '87 World Series, he catches it, and the body of him disappears from the MRI room, leaving the doctors in there who were studying him before questioning why they were even there in the first place. It also happens to be that this person also becomes the mayor of the town in which the hospital is in, so it's kind of odd for sure. Obviously, from that episode alone, it really isn't too concerned with, like, cause and effect, because time in this universe really doesn't make sense. There's no past, present, or future. It just all happens at the same time. And I will say that this concept doesn't come into play until, like, the last third of the show. Like, this is episode 10, and there's only, like, a few episodes left. So this whole concept is just build up to the finale, I guess. Project Sandman is a sleep-related project by Dr. Lona and Elmer's love interest. Although I actually hesitate in phrasing it like that, because Elmer, through most of the show, is a sexual harasser and a defiler of bodies. Like, he consistently gets turned down by Lona because of his advancements, and his only reaction to this, after being put off for so long, is to cut off the head of a deceased homeless man and make it to look like himself, and he puts it in a bowling bag to try to give it to Lona. That's not funny. It's really dumb. And so his entire sort of, like, struggle throughout the rest of the show is trying to find the head and keep it a secret. Otherwise, he'll be fired from the hospital, which that doesn't even come back into play in the show ever again, so it's not fully understood what Project Sandman truly is about, but it seems like it's studying lucid dreaming. Elmer just happens to be a person who has some traits that allow him to dream in the way that he does, and he can even bring people into the dream. And to be honest, it's less explained in Swedenborgian space. Like, it's a concept that could be expanded into a second season, but they really have nothing to do with it. And so with those concepts out of the way, let's talk about the finale. The finale of the show is easily the most anticlimactic finale I've ever seen for a show. It doesn't help when nearly a third of the episode is dedicated to recapping previous episodes, just like, oh, these people must have like skipped out on episodes 2 through 12, so we'll have some more backstory here and just have it be in an hour and 17-minute episode. The other part of that first 50 minutes of the episode is a huge amount of exposition dumping via full backstory about why the mill caught fire and how Mary was the sole survivor who saw who lit the fire. And in the series' only truly horrifying concept, you have Ebenezer, who's the owner of this mill. He decides to burn down the mill because he sucks at running a business. And he figures if he burns down the mill and kills the people inside of it, he gets the insurance money. And for each person that dies, he gets more money on top of that. So he figures that after the fire, Mary would have also have been dead as well. Well, unfortunately, for Mary, she's the sole survivor who saw everything, and Ebenezer has this brother named Strauss who operates a hospital right next door to the mill. And so what happens with Strauss is that he uses the kids at the mill as sort of like science experiments about like certain crackpot ideas that he has. And so after the mill fire, he doesn't really have anyone else. So Mary comes back to the town, the company town, to try to give back a hat to some guy, and I can't really remember his name, and I didn't really catch it in the show. And what happens is that she gets nabbed by Dr. Strauss, and she is tortured for 10 days, and is trying to hide the fact that the owner and his brother, right, of the mill, were trying to burn down the mill for insurance money. And so after 10 days, Mary gets stabbed in the head with ice picks. And that's pretty horrifying. Especially in this world where, like, there are whistleblowers. Like, you have to protect whistleblowers. But back then, with company towns, that's even more horrifying. It's a horrifying concept that we learn maybe a little bit too late into the show, in my opinion. Like, it's something that's just a last-minute detail that's like, oh, that's really horrifying. I wish it was more laid out as a big theme in this show. This whole thing of, like, greed and arrogance. Like, that's a big theme, but it should have been more intertwined than just Dr. Stegman's anesthesia reports. So the main goal of the crew at this point in the game is to commence a seance with Elmer, who's a lucid dreamer, to open up a doorway through the Old Kingdom, or the Swedenborgian space, to go into the Old Kingdom and to traverse back in time to try to prevent the fire, or at least try to save the people who were in the fire to save Kingdom Hospital. Because for Mary, we find out that her ringing in the bell is what causes the earthquakes, which, don't even get me started on the weird thing of like the black noise sort of concepts that the seismologist brings up later in the show. It makes almost as much sense as fairy dust to me. But, it wasn't well presented. But yeah, so they theorize that by, going back in time, saving Mary, saving all this stuff, that, it'll stop the earthquakes from happening. And might I just say that this whole rest of the part is the most anticlimactic part. Because in the previous episode, you have the narrator that says some will live and some will die. Well, that was just a flat-out lie, because no one dies. No one from the main cast dies. You would think that there'd be more of a struggle because, like, you have people like Paul and Strauss who have been trying to stop people from helping Mary, because they want more dead bodies, I guess, and they don't want them to succeed, but they don't really do anything to confront them about it.
Had enough.
Yes, enough of you.
Except in episode 12, and that was it. There's no challenge to this ending because Paul and Strauss don't even, like, attempt to, like, go back and try to, defeat them at all. Like, there's no challenge to it because what happens is that they go into Swedenborgian space, or the Old Kingdom, and what happens is that Peter fights a chalk stick that he used to draw with, and he figures out that if he draws draws a fire hydrant or a fire extinguisher on the wall of the building that's being on fire, then it will make a fire extinguisher and they can use it to save the people's life. And there's no conflict with that. No one gets into their way. No one gets sidetracked and killed. No one dies. And so, like, it just doesn't make sense to me how they could basically say that and then go into the finale and say, oh, no one was actually at stake. No one actually died. It wasn't actually a challenge for them. And so the ending just feels very lackluster. So what really changes after all of this, after saving the children? Well, they find out that because of those actions, because Mary was the one who witnessed them, burn down the whole mill, her and all the other workers basically revolted and called on Ebenezer to be arrested, and he was, and, Mary eventually becomes the founder of Kingdom Hospital. Don't know how, but, it's there. But the weirdest thing about this ending is that once they all go outside, we still find that Paul and Dr. Strauss are still there somehow. Like, somehow they're there, but, like, all these events would not have led them to be there in the first place, so I don't know why they're there. Maybe it would have been expanded upon in a season 2 if ABC allowed for a second season, but it didn't happen. And for Stegman to just sit there and be like, oh, I'm going to get you for, incriminating me by showing off a very incriminating anesthesia report about a person that I screwed up in operation for malpractice, then, they don't really expand upon that, and it just ends. And I guess that's the unfortunate thing, because we don't get to see the result of it. But I guess you can assume that Stegman lost his license and went to prison. That's the best I got. And as you can gather from all of this, ABC did not want to re-up contracts for a second season, which I think is okay because it mostly works as its own thing, although there's some threads that don't fully get explained, and that's left for interpretation, I guess. It's fine for the most part, but I would have liked to have seen maybe another episode where they fully finish off the whole thing, but that's about it. But there were some problems I also had with the show, like consistent exposition dumps, especially towards the end. You had some characters that really aren't that good when you really think about it, and the expanded running time of this show really doesn't utilize the time well enough to tell more interesting stories. Kingdom Hospital, to me, stands as one of those odd experiments of Stephen King that has some good elements, but kind of falls victim again to the usual cliches of King's writing and the pitfalls of his tropes. But I can actually see this being rebooted for the modern day if you put more time and effort into the themes and the storytelling of the characters and ideas that were presented here. And here's the other thing too, is that the episodes are designed in a way that it also feels bingeable. So it could work for a streaming service like Netflix. And for all the weaknesses the show's had, the basic structure of the majority of the episodes lends itself to something like a Netflix original show. If a remake of this show goes a little deeper into the social themes like malpractice, the evils of capitalism, company towns, criminal cover-ups, you might have a really interesting story here. You just have to make sure that the reveals of this show with all the little bits and pieces are drip-fed like an IV tube, instead of given as one huge pill at the very end of the show. I'm going to give Kingdom Hospital a C. Well, I'm feeling a lot better now. So, Halloween is around the corner. So I hope you guys snuggle in with your favorite blanket, have some of your favorite snacks, and watch your favorite horror film this autumn. Whether it be your favorite slasher, or ghost story, or even your favorite Stephen King flick. Have fun. And thank you so much for watching the final episode of the third installment of Stephen King Month. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.